So when we talk about grief, most of us experience grief from time to time. That's a normal human reaction. That's a normal thing that we go through. So as adults, we actually, through the experience of time, we actually learn to deal with grief or to cope with grief to the best of our ability. The problem is when we get to grief and teenagers, the issue is that teenagers don't always know how to deal with grief. The teenager doesn't always know, because their world is already turning upside down with hormonal changes and experiences that they are actually going through. So the death of a loved one or the grieving process for a teenager can be very difficult. Also, parents and adults don't really always understand what the teenager goes through in this grieving process, and sometimes we expect them to actually grieve the way we do, or to experience grief the way we do, or just go through the whole process the way that we think everyone is supposed to grieve, or everyone is supposed to go through this grieving process. So there are different things. First of all, let's talk a bit about grieving, and also the different kinds of grief that a teenager actually goes through. So I've made a list of them here, and so it's not very clear for the video, but there are different types of grief that a teenager actually experiences. And we're not always aware of their different types of grief, or their different grieving experiences, or what's happening in the world of the teenager when it comes to grief. So the first thing is grieving is sibling separation. So when we talk about sibling separation, we don't necessarily talk about the death of a sibling, but sibling separation can be things like the sibling moving away to go and study somewhere, moving to another town to study, the sibling perhaps getting married and moving out, or just normal, the sibling moving out of the house. They've grown up and they want to start living their own way and setting up their own life, which is a normal occurrence. But in the teenager, that causes grief, which is called sibling separation. So sometimes we only think that grief is just the death of someone or the death of something, where in the meanwhile it can also be something like the separation. Then also divorce division. Divorce division can also cause quite a bit of grief for the teenager. So suddenly mom and dad is living in the same house, there's issues, they divorce, and one of the parents move out. And that causes grief in the teenager, that causes grief in the adolescent. The whole situation in the house changes, the whole dynamic in the house changes, because suddenly there were two parents, and no matter what happened, no matter how, what was the situation in the house that caused the separation or the divorce, in the teens world there were two parents, and suddenly there's a division happening. Mom moved out, or dad moved out, and suddenly it's becoming, their world is turned upside down, which can also cause grief in the life of the teenager. Then one which is normally the first real experience for a teenager, but also for a child, is the death of a pet. Sometimes it plays a big impact, a big role in the life of the teenager. A death of a pet, doesn't matter what sort of pet it is. If it's a dog, a cat, it can be a mouse, a guinea pig, whatever, any sort of death experience can cause grief. The teenager gets attached to an animal, and sometimes there's also some other values added to that animal, because maybe it's a grandmother or grandparent or uncle or someone that they really valued that passed away, that gave them the pet. So this is also sometimes a real issue, the death of a pet. Then also school change, which happens a lot. I mean, how many of us actually finish the school in the same school we started in year 1 or year 0? That happens a lot. There's a lot of grief happening when it's moving schools, changing the environment, having to say goodbye to friends, having some cases it is also they started a relationship, with another person in school, another student in the school, and suddenly they have to move away, and separation happens, which is also a cause of some grief in the life of the teenager. And then also one which I worked a lot with when I was working at a high school as a counselor is romantic troubles. Teenagers' lives go up and down the whole time. The romantic troubles happen a lot. They will fall in love the morning with he'll be the best thing ever, the man of my dreams, and the next morning they will break up. And the teenager experienced grief. Once I had a teenage boy who his girlfriend actually broke up with him, and he was actually sitting in front of my office wailing because it was such a big impact on his life. But they were also adding issues to that, why it had such a great impact on him. But romantic troubles are actually, I mean, that's part of being a teenager. There's always romantic troubles. There's always things like falling in love and falling out of love. But we as adults need to understand that, and sometimes this romantic stuff's real. I mean, we sometimes he's going to fall in love again next week, or she's going to fall in love again, and but it's real emotions, it's real experiences. So we as adults need to actually really understand that, understand what your teenager goes through in romantic troubles. So okay, so let's talk a bit about grief and how a teenager or an adolescent actually experience grief, or how does they cope with grief. Now, first of all, we first need to just make a clarification on the terms grieving and mourning. So grieving, the word grief or grieving, is a natural reaction to death, and it's an internal experience. So grieving or grief is an internal experience. It's not external, it's internal. While mourning is a public expression of my internal grief. So mourning is a public expression of my internal grief. So there's two sorts of definitions. So first of all, there's grief, and then there's mourning. And the mourning is normally part of the funeral and laying flowers somewhere, and that's a public expression, while grief is internal. And we don't always know what's happening in a person when it comes to grief. And if grief is not really dealt with, not that grief will go away, it becomes bearable, but if it's not dealt with, we can get situations like grief with complications where unhealthy things happen, where unhealthy behaviors start to happen. Person doesn't want to leave their house because of the fear that the person who passed away might come back and won't know they're there. They don't want to move away. It's just sort of almost getting to a place where your fear or your grief becomes like visualized in the person. The person is still alive, not in your mind physically alive. The total denial, or getting to a place where the grave or the place, if it was an accident, almost gets worshipped. Sometimes you will see that also in the sense of what some people's graves look like, how they actually shower the graves with flowers or gifts or things to actually deal with their grief. That normally happens when there's grief with complications. But if it's just a normal grieving process, and there's ways of dealing with grief. Now, how does a teenager or an adolescent deal with grief? First of all, grief is a natural reaction. So for all of us, including the teenager, and while I mention this, it's also, most of these things also work for us as adults. So first of all, grief is a natural occurrence. It's a natural thing. It's natural to grieve. It's good to grieve. But as I said before, when it starts getting out of hand, or strange behaviors start to come up, that is also when we need to actually start speaking to counselors, someone to just guide you through the grieving process. Alright, then we also need to know that each grieving experience is unique. I'm grieving different than the way my wife would grieve. My children grieve different than I do. My children, I've got two sons, they're two brothers, they grieve different from each other. The one is more expressive and the one is more internal. Each person's grief is unique. Each grieving situation is unique. Each grieving experience is unique, and there are no right and wrongs to grieve. There's not a right, I mean, you need to do this or you need to do that, and this is how you grieve. Each grieving experience is unique, and there's no right and wrong. The only issue is that sometimes when we grieve, we tend to go into destructive or negative behaviors, like substance abuse, alcohol abuse, self-harm, those sort of behaviors, which you actually need help for. So, but there's no way that I can say to you, you need to do this to grieve, or that's wrong, you can't do that. Sorry. Grieving is a unique experience, and there's no right and wrong to grieve. Every death is unique, and the experience is differently. So every death is unique. The way that a person would react to the death of, let's say, a grandmother or grandfather, to the death of, let's say, a parent or an aunt or a sibling, or just someone that they knew or a friend. Each one's death experience, or every death is unique, and each death is experienced differently. Some people are more close to a friend than to a sibling, or whatever is the situation, but each one and each situation is differently. So it's not necessary that the person will grieve the same way they grieved when a grandparent passed away. And even two grandparents, mother, grandfather, each death experience there is different. Each grieving experience is different. There's no set way that a person grieves, and it comes from internally. There are many issues that influence the grieving process. So sometimes things happen that assist in the grieving process or make it actually worse. So here are some of them. First of all, in the grieving process, what is your support system, or what's the support system of the teenager? What's the support system of the grieving person? If there's a good support system, sometimes it's good and will help. If there's no support system, the person might react differently. So what is the support system? The second one is the circumstances of death. Sometimes a person's grieving process is different when, let's say, it's a loved one that had a terminal illness. They saw the person deteriorate over time, and it was almost like a feeling of relief when the person passed away, because that person is no longer in pain or no longer suffering. Where when a person just dies without any warning, let's say a car accident or a heart attack or something that we didn't see this coming, that can also have a great influence in the grieving process. Whether or not the teenager, and for adult too, whether that person actually found the person's body. Different situations. Again, car accident come up. I mean, I've heard stories of people that driving saw a car accident, they went to help, and it's one of their loved ones. That plays a big role. In suicide cases too, that plays a role. Also, if what happened in our family, also a person went to go and have a bit of a lie down. He was an older person. He went to have a lie down. His wife came to speak to him, and she found him that he had passed away. That's not expected. Those sort of processes actually have a big impact on the grieving process. All right, developmental and emotional age of the teenager. If the teenager is really, some teenagers are, their developmental age and their emotional age are higher than other teenagers. I mean, there's some teenagers are really very well emotionally developed by the age of 14, 15, while other by the age of 20 or 19 is not really emotionally developed. So that plays quite a role in the grieving process, the developmental age of the teenager. And then also what is important is to know is the teen's previous experience with death. So the way that they've experienced death before, that plays a role. How do they cope with it? How did they experience it? How was the process? Was the process really very emotional, very draining? What was happening there? And the previous experience actually will play a role in the new experience. Although each experience is unique, each experience is different, they do play a role because of the fact that we went through this whole process, and our brain actually remembers some of these processes that we went through. Right, and then also remember, grief is ongoing and does not end. So grief is ongoing and does not end. In your life, throughout your whole life, you'll grieve the person because you'll think of them at special events, let's say a wedding, Christmas, birthday, special, let's say graduation or anything like that, and suddenly the grief is back. But it's not, in most cases, it is not as severe as it originally was, but we are constantly actually grieving. So it does not really get better, it just gets bearable. We just learn how to cope with our grief. Then also, how does a teenager's grief differ from the grief of an adult? It's interesting that the teenager wants to be independent. The teenager wants to show independence. They want to do everything on their way, their own way, and in most cases they'd rather struggle than ask an adult for help, because they are figuring out things on their own. They are working things out on their own. So grief can make a teenager being isolated because they grieve on their own. They don't want to be grieving with the others. So be aware of the fact, if you have a grieving teenager, that they would sometimes just isolate themselves, which is a normal thing, and there's nothing to be really concerned about. But also from time to time, reach out to your teenager, reach out to the teenager that's grieving. Right, then also, the teenager is egocentric, and their egocentricity stress the need for normality. So because the teenager believes the whole world is watching them, they're very focused on what other people think, what other people do, and they actually, each teenager is normally under the impression that every person is watching them. That's why they are so worried about their looks, and because they think everyone's watching them, everyone's judging them. So because of this, the teenager would sometimes try and act as everything is normal. They don't want to stand out in the crowd. They don't want to be known as the kid whose father died, or the kid whose mother passed away, or the kid whose sister left, or the kid whose parents divorced. So they try and act as normal as possible. So sometimes parents get a bit upset because the teenager doesn't really grieve. Didn't they love this person? But it's a normal process for them to try and act as normal as possible. And then also, which is more a new thing, and I think a lot of adults struggle with this one, is that teenagers start to turn, and this is a normal modern trend, is that the teenagers start to turn to social media about their grief, posting things about grief, whatever, on social media. So it's interesting that if you look at the way that teenagers grieve, social media and the internet plays actually quite a role in their grieving process these days. So it changed from the way we used to grieve to a more social media type of grieving process that teenagers actually go into. Then also, teenaging or teenagers or adolescence is actually a time of actually questioning yourself, questioning also your spirituality. And so especially during a grieving process or in a grieving process, the teenager will start to question their spirituality. They will start to question the religion of their parents or the religion that they grew up in. That plays a role. So sometimes we need to actually be a bit more gracious when it comes to this, because sometimes they will, especially if you are in a very religious home, a Christian home, and suddenly your child's starting to become really anti-church or whatever, just be a bit gracious. Just show grace. It is part of their growing up. I mean, it's like one of the things about spirituality is also that when they get to a certain age, they don't really want to go to the same church as mom and dad. They want to go to a different church, that sort of stuff. Be open to allow this. Obviously, when you see they are turning into something really weird, like some sort of sect or something, we need to step in. But this is sort of a normal process for them to actually start question their spirituality also. And especially the grieving process is one of those triggers for that. And then teen grief is hidden under other behaviors. So sometimes the teenager's grieving process will be hidden. It won't be as normal or as visible. There'll be other things, like suddenly they might have like really, they start acting out. They've got bad behavior, rebelliousness. Suddenly this will come in. And but it's sort of the way where they are actually hiding their grief. They're sort of covering the grief, but with other behaviors. Sometimes also negative behaviors, eating disorders, self-harm, drug and alcohol abuse, dangerous sexual activity. That sort of things can also be playing a role in the teenager's grieving process. So how do we cope with grief? Interesting, a guy named Wolfeld created a model, and this model, first of all, he says the first step in the model is to first of all accept or help the teen or allow the teen to accept the reality of the death. Help the teen to accept the reality of the death. Don't try and protect the teen from it. Make the teen part of the whole process. Make the teen part of your grieving process. Yes, don't as an adult or a parent go into a denial, but help the teen to accept. Then the second part of Wolfeld's model is the next step is to move toward the pain of the loss. In this step, the counselor has to allow the teen to sit with the pain. The counselor, the parent, the adult, the carer, the mentor, allow the teen to sit with the pain. Allow the teen to just be aware of the pain of the loss. And then lastly also is help the teen to remember the person who died. Have a discussion with them. Let them bring photos or videos or whatever, especially if they come to counseling. Let them get into all those ask them to bring photos, or normally, or these days a lot of photos are actually on our phones. And you as a counselor might be sit with this person as an adult, a carer, a mentor, a parent, a grandparent, any person that they look up to. Just be patient and sit and talk about the person. Sometimes we as adults go into a phase of denial, and we actually don't want to talk about this person because it hurts. But in the process, also think of the teenager, helping them to cope with their hurt. Grief is with us. Grief comes in stages. Grief are like waves. Some waves are big. Sometimes it gets really small little waves, and then suddenly there's a big wave again, maybe 4 or 5 years after the death of the person. A big wave will hit us. And we just need to, we carry our grief. But if you get to a place where you struggle, where you really struggle with grief, whether it's you, with your teenager, whether it's one of your friends, it's good to actually refer them to a counselor. Refer them to someone that can actually help them. Because the problem is sometimes we get stuck in our grief. Stuck in our grief, which causes us not to be able to move on. Stuck in our grief in ways that we not be able to actually experience life. There are so many mental health issues that can occur in a person's life if you do not deal with your grief. Don't let your grief turn into grief with complications. Grief is a normal process. Grief is part of life. And if you get stuck, go to a counselor to help you to get unstuck and cope with your grief.